Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening, because it's Black History Month, once again, we want to look at the links between Africa and America in ways that sometimes aren't traced. It's not easy to trace them, the ones we're going to be looking at, but it's important to, and we now have new tools and techniques and technologies that we can use to do this with. So we're going to look at, in effect, the link between Africa and America in what are called foodways. Foodways are pathways of food traditions. Not just the particular objects of food, but the ways of preparing the food, the ceremony around consuming food, the traditions and the folklore, and ethnobotany behind the food preparation. All of this is something that's culturally learned, and therefore it has to be relearned, often without any reference to written sources. It's learned by women, it's learned by men. The agriculture process is very complex, and it's something that is deeply culturally embedded. It is agriculture, and it's cultural as much as it is plant-based. That's why we want to look at it as a kind of new lens on the transatlantic tradition, one that can be looked at with great subtlety now that we have some of the new techniques available. So we're calling it Mapping Foodways in African and American History. On one level, you can start this kind of thing as Dan McCall, a famous historian and anthropologist from BU, stated a long time ago, about 50 years ago. He published a book called Africa in Time Perspective. And the subtitle of it's very interesting, A Discussion of Historical Reconstruction from Unwritten Sources. This is interesting because usually historians stick to written sources, and in fact some historians argue there's no such thing as history without written sources. Now, that's not true, and it's not very instructive for cultural history, which is part of what we want to look into in this connection in the Atlantic trade. In Black History Month, one subject to explore is the unwritten sources that exist about African and African American food systems. We're all the inheritors of that in North America, certainly in Central America and the Caribbean, and even more so in Brazil. And one way to start the talk is to actually meet some African American chefs who are cooking African food and talking about it. Recently, a chef born in Ethiopia but raised in Sweden made it his mission to talk with chefs cooking African food in Dallas, Texas. He made a special program about it. Let's take a look.
You got that pheasant now? And the way you want the gravy, just pour it right over the top. Yeah, there we go. Get saucy with it.
Yeah. I'm excited, man.
Oh,
it looks good.
Thank you.
I like the smell, the smokiness, you know?
Yeah, that's my favorite part about the entire thing.
This is delicious.
We titled it just Cowboys and Indians because Western Africa was filled with farmers and agriculturalists. They were considered to be the original cowboys of America. And then you have rice, which is Carolina gold rice, which is one of the original grains brought to America from Africa.
Yeah.
John Rhodes is so talented, but he also is a chef with a mission.
He's a chef with a mission, according to this interviewer, and the mission is in part to bring knowledge of African foods to America. What's interesting about this little segment here was the way he referred to Carolina gold rice, brought to the Americas from Africa, according to this chef. Let's go back and look at that, because it's actually an interesting assertion and one that we ought to pay attention to in terms of studying these foodways.
Cowboys of America. And then you have rice, which is Carolina gold rice, which is one of the original grains brought to America from Africa.
Yeah. John Rhodes is so talented, but he also is a chef with a mission. You get some culture, you get some history. And this is a perfect example of telling incredible food stories.
When I eat this dish, the links between the African American and the Nigerian and West African community all comes together. You know what I mean?
Thank you. That's what we're shooting for.
Oh, this is amazing what you showed me. The kitchen, the discipline, being in the neighborhood. The food is amazing, and congrats on your journey, man.
Thank you, Chef.
That's awesome.
Really,
Congrats.
There's many reasons why we lost track of the links between West African food and Southern food, but they're all connected to systemic racism. Take slavery as a starting point to that, where the laborer had no authorship of the food that they were cooking and serving their masters. So 300-400 years later, you come back to a situation where the reference points are gone. And food gives us these reference points that can actually start a new dialogue, build a new bridge, and help you understand it.
Well, that's the question. Can food give us the new reference points and help us to understand what the history of food and food ways, food pathways, is between that part of the world, Africa, and the Americas? A relatively recent history, that is 500 years or so since 1492, and it should be possible to retrace some of these things, especially to their authentic sources. But when we look into the authentic sources, we get some dispute very early on. This woman from Nigeria, for example, has an interesting shop around Dallas where she's selling nothing but African food. And she's selling it to a wider and wider audience. Take a look.
The other ingredients here I'm pretty familiar with. Here's where I would get lost. And as a chef, that's always exciting when you can learn something, right? So this is mostly for stews and soup.
This is the draw soup, one of the go-tos in a lot of Nigerian cooking.
What do you mean with draw?
Do you know how okra has that?
The slime from the okra is really the texture of that,
Yes,
right?
so this abono is soup that we call a draw soup. It
a
goes
little
up.
thicker, that's cool. I didn't know that soup was such a big part of Nigerian cooking.
Of course. The soups all come with the tribe. That's how they know where
The
you're from.
Fulani would have one soup,
Yes.
and the Igbo would have one.
But have you ever had peanut soup?
Now this is an interesting question. According to her, the Fulani would have one soup, the Igbo another soup. The soup comes with the tribe, as she put it. And then she turns to him and says, "But you ever had peanut soup?" Listen to his response. Now remember, he's an Ethiopian who was brought up in Sweden. He's become a chef, and he's now interviewing Africans and African Americans in America about African cuisine. Has he ever had peanut soup?
Yeah.
Oh my
And
gosh.
that, for the record, that is from Ghana, so do not take that.
No, 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 no,
That
no,
is
no.
not from
No, no,
Nigeria,
no.
that is from Ghana.
No.
He's pretty categorical about, for the record, peanut soup is from Ghana, according to him. Not from Nigeria, it's from Ghana. Now, it's very interesting to follow his logic here and to follow their discussion.
I want to make that very clear.
Tribal food is something as Americans we think we're not familiar with. But it's no different than regional cuisine of, let's say, Texas, New England. You have Southern food, you have Creole, which you have learned to appreciate and understand, right? This is the same concept.
We're hungry because we're talking about Nigerian food. What is Nigerian food, right?
Before talking to you about it, would you like to taste it?
Yes.
Please come with me.
Thank you.
It's my kitchen.
I love it.
So first, I want to show you. This is our authentic Nigerian jollof rice.
Jollof rice.
I'm telling you, it doesn't get any better than this.
Oh, it's a big pot.
It is.
Jollof rice, it's almost like noodles in Southeast Asia. You find a version of it all over West Africa. The key ingredients is rice, tomatoes, onions, and peppers.
Jollof rice, when I taste this is like the base for so many rice, right?
Yes.
Jambalaya you find obviously in New Orleans and all throughout the bayou. Also, Spanish paella, Very similar, right?
The jollof rice is the rice that every variations from West Africa, from the Caribbeans, from all over. Like you could tell that it's migrated in different regions with its own twist.
Yeah, it's delicious.
Okay, it's delicious. And according to her, it comes from West Africa, but is it from Nigeria? Well, it's interesting. She argues that, yes, it's a Nigerian jollof rice. But what if you got a Nigerian cook and a Senegalese cook together, promoting, and in fact cooking together, creating an African dish for the Dallas, Texas environment? Take a look.
Nice.
Yes.
Thank you. This is the famous Chepogyan. It looks amazing. Smells so good. It's nice to see Senegal and Nigeria working together.
That's nice.
That's good.
All African.
All
Yes,
Africa.
yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bon appetit. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, it's beautiful.
That's very good.
I've had Chepogyan in Dakar. This tastes even better.
Wow.
It is taste of Nigeria, but it's really taste of West Africa, right? When does the decision making come in to like say, what about Senegal? What about Cameroon? How did that come about?
We wanted to include other communities that were not being properly represented because a lot of them are smaller, so they may not have a need to open up a restaurant. So because the Nigerian community is so big, they can feel, you know, like, hey, we're part of this
Yeah.
this growth.
And also, we have a lot of second-generation Nigerians
Yeah.
born and bred here in America that grew up with the food,
Yeah.
but they're professionals, nurses and doctors and lawyers. They want to have it in an American standard way.
This is our pepper soup.
That's
Catfish pepper soup. We serve the whole fish.
And then that's goatly pepper soup.
Pepper
Yes.
soup.
Wow, the pepper soup is amazing.
Yes, it's very
Because it has this umami flavor, this fish flavor.
Yes.
You're mixing
The
sort of
centipedes.
fish stock and
Yes.
meat stock, right?
That's right.
So you're tasting both, and that is
Yes.
such a killer broth.
Yes.
It almost reminds me almost like a Japanese ramen in a way, right? It's very much on a different tip, you
Yes.
know?
Yeah.
But once I learn how to appreciate it, it's fantastic, right?
Exactly.
That's right.
People who enter the Southwest, they know I'm now entering the Nigerian community.
Yeah.
Now it's interesting, if you look at the bottom part of the screen there, you can see that PBS, which is broadcasting this program, is also advertising their PBS series with Henry Louis Gates, Finding Your Roots. In a sense, it's a kind of parallel to this. He looks at genealogical information through documents, largely. But this is an exploration through the culinary history of these regions. And he asks some very interesting questions, which are very revealing in their scope.
Yes, yes.
Being in this part of town gives access to a whole other demographic,
Exactly.
right?
Yes.
Exactly.
Now with this new location, we're also pulling in people that are not Nigerian, that
Yes.
are curious about the cuisine, that may have never gone to Africa.
Yeah.
But we can bring Africa to them in an
Yes.
authentic way.
You're African American.
Yes.
And do you know where your ancestors are from?
Me, not really, but
Well, chances are from
curious.
Ghana, Nigeria.
Yeah, somewhere on the West Coast, possibly, yeah.
Yeah.
And we've had people come to the restaurant that had taken the test, the
Yeah.
DNA test, and found out, hey, I'm Igbo, or I'm a large percentage Yoruba. What kind of food do they eat?
Now, that's a very interesting interaction there. She says she doesn't know where in West Africa she came from, but she assumes it's West Africa. Well, you know, there's 1,000 miles of difference between these different cultures. And they've had people come in saying that they've taken the DNA test, like the Skip Gates has promoted through his Search of the Roots of various people. But they don't know what they eat in Africa, so they come into this restaurant to find out what, if they're 60% Yoruba or Igbo, would they eat in these areas. It's not as if they've learned themselves. They want to find out about it, and they come to this restaurant run by a woman who doesn't know her origins in West Africa, and who's running a restaurant with basically a Nigerian focus upon it. Very interesting interaction about this whole question of food paths.
So that was really,
Food, exciting to
yeah,
us.
we were excited about that because we wanted to educate them on the food.
Well, you guys should be really proud. You're putting the flag up, and you are bringing both communities together, the American side and the African side.
Yes.
Congrats to them.
Thank you, thank you.
What's fascinating when you start looking under the hood of West African food, it might be unfamiliar to you. But this is the foundation of Southern food, soul food, the cuisine that we love in America, right? It's all here. It's all started in West Africa and came to America through slave trade. When we think about slavery in America,
Now that's an interesting proposition. It's all in West Africa, and it came to America through the slave trade. Let's hear that again, because it's a very interesting representation of a rather complex history. We'll try to pick it up where he's explaining it here. Basically, the thing about West African food, he says,
it might be unfamiliar to you. But this is the foundation of Southern food, soul food, the cuisine that we love in America, right? It's all here. It's all started in West Africa and came to America through slave trade. When we think about slavery in America, predominantly slaves came from West Africa.
So West African brought their foodways and tradition across the Atlantic, and then infusing that with things that were growing here, with scraps, leftover. They really had to become innovators, and that's where your jollof becomes jambalaya, okra, fufu eventually becomes grits. So many of these traditions that we love really started there.
so many of the traditions we love, we started in West Africa, according to this Ethiopian chef. Well, actually, this doesn't clarify some things, although it does make our ignorance more complex. If we ask, is jollof rice from Senegal or Nigeria? Is peanut soup from Nigeria, or as he maintains, just for the record, from Ghana? And throughout all of it, he's assuming that there's a unidirectional flow, that is, a flow in one direction of food from Africa to the Americas. And it's those traditions that provide the food paths that we need to study. But what about the other way around? What about the food that flowed from the Americas to Africa? Well, people like Henry Louis Gates have urged us to look into the slave trade in detail and find out what we can about it now.
The slavevoyages.org website has now completed 10 years of successful operation, drawing on 4 decades of archival research on 5 continents, a revolution in computer processing costs, and with major funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Board, the site now offers access to details of more than 36,000 slave trading voyages between Africa and the New World, a further 11,400 voyages from one part of the Americas to another part of the Americas, and 92,000 Africans who were forced to make these voyages. The role of slave voyages as the basic reference tool for the slave trade to the Americas and now within the Americas is well established. Users can now analyze data, sample estimates of the slave trade, view videos, maps, and animations, consult research essays, contribute corrections to existing data, and add information on voyages that the editors don't even know about.
This is what's interesting. The new technology has laid before us a whole new range of questions. The Mellon Foundation underwrote a lot of it, and this international group of scholars came together, piecing it together to come up with a map and mapping the understanding of specific origins of different slave ships and their destinations, origins and destinations. Then they looked in detail at what happened within the Americas. There's a reshipment towards North America from San Domingue and other places like that. And it's numbered in the tens of thousands of people. And if you look at the whole period, from period to period, you can see, in effect, that there are different volumes involved in different centuries. The 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, by the time of American independence in 1776. All of these are now available online in these new databases. And the total volume is really very interesting. If you look at the origins and the number of slaves involved, represented by the thickness of the arrow, the overwhelming majority went to Brazil, then to the Caribbean islands, and only about 3% came to North America. Now, as the database indicates, several tens of thousands more were sold from the Caribbean up to North America. But if you're trying to follow food paths, this gets very complicated. Professor Gates has been very good in helping us trace roots through things like genealogies, and now it's up to historians to look at the books, in a sense, that have within them a whole series of other kinds of information. Yes, there are documents and written accounts of various slave trips and slave logs, but in addition there are these maps. And the maps are accompanied by diagrams. The diagrams have on them often illustrations of food production, and the floor plans of the different castles in West Africa have a clear indication of where food was stored for the transatlantic version of the slave trade. So if we look at these documents with their maps at a place like Afroterra.org, which is a cartographic free library about the history of African cartography, and look at the maps in detail for specific things like the gardens that are described here, find out what plants were being grown to fuel the slave trade, to, in effect, feed the slaves on their way over to the New World, to look at places like Gorée that are actually visible from space nowadays, but also in the period maps had pictures of gardens with a diagram of what's indicated in various parts of the gardens. These can be looked at in detail, and ought to be, as well as in South Africa. We're familiar with Robben Island because it was the place where Mandela was, in effect, incarcerated for decades. But it has a very interesting history with reference to the rest of the area in South Africa. If we look at the floor plans in detail of these castles, we can learn a lot about the food supplies that came out of Africa as part of the slave trade, but also were imported into Africa. And this is actually quite interesting if you look at it in detail, because on the early maps there's an indication, as well as in the later ones, that there was an importation into Africa of crops from the New World, and they were experimented upon. And articles like Agents of Empire, Steps Towards an Ecology of Imperialism can take a look at some of these, look at the experimentation, the annotation in the historical documents that give us a clue as to what was introduced. This is what's called about a discussion of historical reconstruction from the unwritten sources. In some cases, things like maize have been studied in great detail and with very precise information by James McCann over at Boston University. And the impact of maize on the whole continent of Africa is enormous. It was introduced during the slave trade period because it's a New World crop. So were peanuts, by the way. To argue that peanut soup is neither Nigerian nor Ghanaian, but perhaps Senegalese, is to miss the point that peanuts were introduced from the New World to Africa as an aspect of the slave trade. It then became widely diffused up and down the African coast and is part of the cuisine that American chefs from the African tradition all embrace as part of West African cuisine. Well, BU has started to run workshops that enable people to look at some of the mapping of Africa in this regard. There's one coming up in March, and you can scan in the QR codes and learn a lot more about it. It's being put together by the African Studies Center at Boston University and the Afroterra Cartographic Free Library, an extraordinary library here in Boston that has the originals of these slave trade maps, and many more since the slave trade as well. Mapping foodways in Africa and in American history is crucial, just as the study of the roots of genealogical origin is crucial. The material is available now and can be studied in detail because of the kinds of new technologies available through computers and the digitization of the maps and books from the era of the slave trade. It's time to undertake this work because we're beginning to realize that we're on a finite planet with a finite food supply, and we better learn how it works, where it came from, what it does, and how we can survive by preserving it.